Think logically. We don't lend money to bottom-tier farmers.
Kevin, the bank officer, said this to me with a smug smile as I came in to discuss a loan. It was clear that there was no point in reasoning with this man any further. With a sigh in my heart, I told him what I had been thinking.
Fine, then I'll stop renting out my land to you.
Kevin's jaw dropped, and then he burst into laughter.
A poor guy like you renting out land to a bank? Do you even hear yourself?
Kevin laughed uncontrollably, but little did he know he'd be pale and trembling within minutes.
My name is Nathan.
I'm 51 years old, and I work as a farmer in the town where I was born. When I was young, I worked for a well-known restaurant chain in the city, but when my grandparents' health declined,
I left my job and returned home.
For over 20 years, I'd been growing vegetables on my grandparents' farm, carrying on at my own pace. Some people might wonder why it was me, the grandson, and not my parents who inherited my grandparents' farm.
The answer is simple: I don't have parents.
I used to live in another prefecture with my parents, but when I was in elementary school, my father disappeared. He left without a word, just vanished. With only my mother left, we couldn't make ends meet, so she turned to her parents, my grandparents, for support. After that, my mother went out to work, and I was raised by my grandparents, who worked on the farm. But this peaceful life would be struck by tragedy once more. When I was 10, I received word that my mother, who worked in the city, had been killed in a traffic accident. From then on, I was formally taken in by my grandparents, and the three of us lived together. Even as a child, I felt guilty for depending on my grandparents, so I asked if I could help with the farm work.
What are you saying? You're still a kid. Kids should just enjoy themselves and play. But I want to help you, Grandpa. And I'm interested in growing vegetables too. When I kept asking, my grandparents eventually gave in and let me help out.
They seemed thrilled every day, teaching me all about how to grow vegetables. They were especially happy not because I was helping, but because I had a real interest in vegetables. With smiles on their faces, they'd put me on the tractor and teach me the ropes. A lot of kids don't even like vegetables, but you eat everything up so happily.
And you're even interested in growing them.
We're so lucky to have such a wonderful grandson. The faces of my grandparents, who work in the fields under the clear sky every day, are well-tanned and deeply lined. Seeing the two of them, their faces crinkled with laughter as they patted my head, warmed my heart deeply. Knowing how many years they've spent under the sun and rain. They took care of me, making sure I always had warm meals and a soft bed. But even as they looked after me, I knew they cried in front of my mother's portrait after I had gone to bed. I can still remember that scene vividly. One night, I woke up to go to the bathroom and saw light coming from the room with the family altar.
Peeking through the sliding door, I wondered what was happening.
There, I saw my grandmother, who was always so cheerful during the day, breaking down in front of my mother's photo. My grandfather sat beside her, supporting her frail frame, and gently said over and over, "At the very least, let's raise him well, in her place." That was the first time I realized my grandparents, too, were enveloped in deep sorrow. Since then, I've tried my best to brighten their spirits, hoping to bring them some of the light my mother once did. Helping with the farm was one part of my plan, and I also made an effort to keep the house filled with laughter.
Saying funny things every day to make my grandparents smile.
Whether because of this or not, the number of nights I heard crying from the altar room gradually decreased. And we slowly settled into a peaceful daily life together. By the time I was in high school, my grandparents began to grow frail and could no longer manage the farm on the same scale as before. So, we rented out some of the farmland, drastically reducing our yield. Around then, the only crops my grandparents grew were cabbage, which required a lot of land but minimal effort, and cherry tomatoes, which could be grown abundantly on a small plot. This much, we can handle on our own. So don't worry about us, just leave this rural place and find a job that suits you.
No need to be tied to farming. But after I graduate, I was thinking I'd take over the farm. Intent on supporting my grandparents, I tried to convince them with all my might.
Yet both of them shook their heads, encouraging me instead to go to college in the city and find a job outside of farming.
I heard from your teacher, Mr. Manning, that you're bright enough for anything. Hard times are coming for farming, with cheap vegetables being imported from overseas. That's why I want to help with the farm, to make things easier for you both." Surprisingly, it was my grandmother who reacted sternly to my words. What kind of grandparents would want to ease their burden at the expense of their grandson's future? Or happiest when you have a life filled with happiness? I was touched by her feelings, but I still couldn't bring myself to leave. I was, of course, worried about my grandparents, but part of me was also apprehensive about living on my own. Sensing my unease, my grandfather softened his expression. "Step away from farming for a while and find what you truly want to do. Study hard in the city, and if you still want to come back to farming, return here. Then, you can bring us the new agricultural practices of your generation." Yeah, okay. In the end, I began studying for exams and was accepted to a prestigious university in the prefecture. I enrolled in the engineering department to study computer software. Though I'd been immersed in farming all my life, I was captivated by computers when I first used one at a friend's house in high school. So, when they urged me to explore something other than farming, computers were the first thing that came to mind. After graduating, I got a job as a programmer at a large company in the city. I worked tirelessly from dawn till dusk, immersing myself in the latest, then rare computer technology and configurations. A fulfilling job and a new lifestyle. As I threw myself into the endless flood of information, 10 years flew by in a flash. I'd make it back home to my grandparents' place for New Year's and summer, but gradually, work became an excuse to visit less often. Seeing them shrink a little each year, I'd remind them to take care of their health, but I didn't truly understand the reality. It took another phone call for me to recognize my own foolishness. The shrill ring in the early morning brought back memories of that call I received as a child when I was told of my mother's death. With shaking fingers and a cold sweat on my brow, I answered the phone to hear my grandmother's tearful voice. "Your grandfather, he collapsed." Panicked, I rushed back home and went to the hospital my grandmother told me about. Apparently, my grandfather had pushed himself too hard, working in the rain, and had been taken in just short of pneumonia. They assured me his life wasn't in danger, but seeing him lying under those crisp, white hospital sheets, his body thin like a withered branch, filled me with grief. "Grandpa, how did it come to this? I'm sorry to have called so early in the morning. I was just so shocked, and I couldn't think straight." Sitting by his bed, my grandmother kept apologizing, her back hunched with age. "When did they become so frail?" All this time, I'd been living far away, out of touch with my hometown. Stunned, I resolved to move back home that very day. My grandparents tried to talk me out of it once again, but I insisted, "This is my life. Let me make my own choices. If I don't come back now, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." I couldn't just abandon my company, so I informed them of my decision to resign and began the process of handing over my work. My boss, Alex, who had looked out for me since I joined, tried to persuade me to stay. But when he saw how determined I was, he gave me a knowing smile. "We're really going to miss your innovative ideas here. They've been a great motivator for everyone. If you ever need anything, just give me a call." I thought he was giving me too much credit, but I was genuinely touched that he would miss me. And so, I left my corporate life behind and returned to my hometown. In the end, my grandparents were delighted, and they enjoyed our life together after so many years. Once back in the fields, I could see how much the farm had shrunk since I was in high school. We had rented out most of the unused land, but there were still large sections left untouched, with wild grass growing thickly. Seeing the ample space available, my eyes lit up. The truth was, I'd been nurturing a plan in my mind ever since my years working in the city. "Grandpa, would it be alright if I grew something I'm passionate about here?" "Do whatever you want. I plan to leave the whole farm in your hands one day, so go ahead and try things out as you like." And with that, I immediately started cultivating something new. It was herbs, an unusual choice in our area, where no one paid much attention to them. Nowadays, you can find herbs at any grocery store, but back then, they were still considered a novel ingredient. I believed herbs had potential not only for cooking but for their fragrance and appeal as a sensory experience. Luckily, there was equipment my grandfather had used to grow cherry tomatoes in a greenhouse, so I used that to cultivate the seedlings. I began producing herbs in bulk for restaurants while also persuading local supermarkets to create a small display for my products. Fortunately, as herbs were starting to trend, my herb farm took off better than I had expected. After a few years, my herb sales outpaced my grandparents' vegetable sales. They had grown quite old by then, and this seemed like a good opportunity for them to hand over the business entirely to me. My herb garden became well known locally, and my grandparents would beam with pride whenever neighbors praised me as such a wonderful grandson. Soon, people started requesting herbs for their home gardens, and others suggested selling bouquets made from the flowers instead of just the leaves, turning my herb garden into a neighborhood favorite. The vegetables we grew filled people's bellies, but the herbs you grow fill their hearts. My grandmother said one day, leaving me a bit flustered. But just when I thought I'd finally made my grandparents proud, they both passed away within a short time of each other. We're so happy that you've grown into such an admirable person. It was a blessing to have a grandson who brings smiles to people's faces. Left alone, I felt a deep sadness, but I also held their parting words close to my heart. I knew that the life I had now was thanks to inheriting my grandparents' farming legacy. From that point on, I resolved to grow the farm further and make it my life's mission. With that in mind, I decided to expand the business and sought a loan from the bank. Thank you for your time today. The place I visited was the local bank. The man handling my loan was named Kevin, and he greeted me with a friendly smile. Since I was planning to expand my grandparents' farm, I needed a significant amount of funding. So, I had come to the bank, hoping for a loan. No need to be so tense. Relax. Thank you. A friend recommended you, and I feel reassured seeing such a kind face. I let my genuine thoughts slip, and Kevin chuckled. As our conversation shifted to small talk, though, Kevin made no effort to ask about my business plan. If this continued, I'd just be wasting time. So, though I felt it might seem abrupt, I decided to steer the conversation back to business and took out my proposal. Here's my business plan. If I could start by explaining. No need. I don't see anything worth discussing. I was about to explain the essence of my project when Kevin cut me off with a dismissive laugh. Feeling uneasy and wondering what was going on, I nervously asked a question. Do you mean today is just an introductory meeting? No, I'm telling you we're not lending you money. So there's no need for pointless discussion, right? With that, Kevin shot me an unpleasant look. Frankly, turning up to discuss a serious loan dressed in mud-stained work clothes doesn't convey any commitment. Also, that's your pickup truck in the parking lot, isn't it? Kevin pointed to the parking lot visible from the window. Sure enough, the light truck I rushed to the bank in is parked there. I can't offer a loan to someone who drives that kind of vehicle. I apologize for my attire. I had an urgent job come up, so I came directly from the farm. I had planned to wear a suit for the meeting. However, just an hour before our appointment, a client had contacted me wanting a tour of my herb farm. I'd been busy showing them around right up until it was time to head to the bank, so rather than being late, I decided to come in my work clothes and truck. All of this effort was for one purpose: to have my business plan reviewed and secure funding from the bank. Determined to be heard, I took the proposal out once more and placed it in front of Kevin. If you just look at the details, you'd understand. I've spent years working on this plan. Please, at least give it a glance. Enough already. You're too persistent. To my shock, Kevin roughly brushed my arm aside. Furthermore, he snatched the plan from my hands, tore it to shreds, and tossed it into the trash.
I was stunned, left staring in disbelief at the scattered remains of my hard work.
Kevin sneered in satisfaction and said, "Use some common sense. Banks only lend to clients with a clear ability to repay. We're not in the business of lending to low-level farmers." It was clear that reasoning with this man was useless. With a sigh in my heart, I told him what I'd been thinking. "All right, then I'll stop renting out my land to you."
Kevin was dumbfounded for a moment, then burst into laughter.
"Rent out land? What are you talking about?
We're not in need of land from a poor farmer like you."
You'd make a better comedian than a farmer." Laughing heartily, Kevin opened the door wide and said, "Thank you for your time today." This way to the exit. Feeling dazed and baffled, I returned to the parking lot.
In fact, it was a mutual contact who had arranged this loan discussion. An old acquaintance who knew my business plan had vouched for me and said he had connections at the bank, insisting I should present my proposal. Trusting his recommendation, I came to this meeting, but it seemed Kevin had no idea I'd been introduced. Sitting back in my truck, I sighed deeply and decided to call my acquaintance. After just a few rings, he picked up. That was quick.
"So, did you get the full loan?"
The voice on the other end was that of my former boss, Alex. He had moved up to the role of executive director with an impressive network of connections. It was Alex who had encouraged me to try securing a loan through this local bank, saying he'd put in a good word.
Unable to hide my confusion, I explained everything that had just happened. "I'm afraid I was turned down. I didn't even get to discuss the loan." "What did you say?" Even over the phone, I could hear the weight in Alex's voice. After I recounted the entire incident with Kevin from start to finish, Alex let out a deep sigh. "It seems there was a misunderstanding at the bank." "Please wait there, I'll sort this out right now." Since this was Alex, someone who had always been there for me, I couldn't refuse his request.
Though I wanted to get back to my herb farm, I decided to wait a bit longer out of respect for him.
Then, just 10 minutes later,
an elderly man came rushing out of the bank, looking flustered.
"Nathan,
please wait, I beg you to give us another chance to discuss this." The man, pale and breathless, introduced himself as Watson, the bank's president, bowing deeply. "I received a call from Alex earlier and finally learned the situation.
This is entirely due to my lack of oversight, and I have no words to express my apology. Please, raise your head. It sounds like you're saying the loan is out of reach anyway."
In response to my answer, Mr. Watson shook his head vigorously from side to side. At that moment, Kevin appeared, following closely behind him.
"Mr. Watson, is everything all right?
You left so suddenly, I was worried."
"All right? How could it be? Do you have any idea who this man is?"
Mr. Watson snapped at Kevin, his eyes blazing with anger.
But Kevin, with a misplaced grin, began to say something unbelievable.
"So, still loitering around, I see. Figured you'd stick around just to cause a scene in the parking lot." Kevin cast a scornful look my way, then turned to Mr. Watson with a forced smile.
"I'll escort this lowlife out immediately."
"I wouldn't want him to cause you any trouble, so please, go back inside."
"Kevin, you really didn't listen to a word, did you? This man is no lowlife.
And changing your attitude based on a client's appearance is utterly unacceptable."
As Mr. Watson's anger grew, Kevin stood there, wide-eyed and gaping in shock.
As soon as Kevin realized that Mr. Watson's anger was directed at him, his composure began to crumble.
"But, what's the big deal about this, farmer?
I don't understand why you're so upset, Mr. Watson. This man, Nathan, came to us as a referral from Alex, the executive of Wells Corporation, one of our bank's most important clients." Hearing this, Kevin's face turned pale, and he began to tremble. Alex, a member of the family that owned my previous company, was poised to become the next president. And Wells Corporation had a long-standing relationship with this bank. That was why Alex went out of his way to introduce me. I informed you, Kevin, that Nathan would be coming in today to discuss a loan.
So why on earth did you deny his application without even reviewing it?
Well, He seemed to finally grasp the seriousness of the situation. Kevin turned pale, starting to shake uncontrollably.
Watching him look back and forth between me and Mr. Watson with a frightened expression, I thought he might simply apologize.
Sure, he had treated me poorly earlier, but after all, I was a potential loan client introduced by Alex. I wanted to handle this as smoothly as possible.
However, Kevin didn't seem to feel the same way.
His pride seemed to get in the way, and he glared at me resentfully, muttering complaints under his breath. I apologize for the disrespect, but, excuse me for saying this man arrived in a pickup truck.
Kevin's response left me, and even Mr. Watson, stunned in disbelief.
Even after all that had been said, he still had the audacity to argue further. And yet, seeing our shocked silence, Kevin seemed to think he'd made his point. He regained a bit of his color and, with great effort, began explaining his view, spitting out his words with enthusiasm.
No matter who recommends who, if they lack the ability to repay, a bank can't grant a loan. That's what I concluded.
Kevin pointed at my muddy work clothes and then at the pickup truck outside, continuing with pride. Even with a big client backing him, if he's just a poor farmer, we can't lend to him.
In fact, lending just because he's a client's friend would actually mean changing our standards based on the person.
So, that's how you evaluated him. Mr. Watson's quiet voice interrupted Kevin's rant. The sudden calmness in Mr. Watson's tone took Kevin by surprise, leaving him speechless.
But as bankers, it's our job to thoroughly understand our clients' backgrounds.
I thought I taught you that, Kevin.
That's exactly what I did.
I judged Nathan based on his clothes and his vehicle.
Kevin's persistence finally snapped Mr. Watson's patience. Don't be ridiculous. Anyone working at this bank should know who this man is.
Nathan is the owner of a vast amount of land,
including the very land on which our bank sits. Land? You mean he was serious about that? Kevin's jaw dropped, and he stared at me, visibly shaken, as if he might collapse from the shock. Watching his ridiculous reaction, I struggled to hold back laughter. When my grandfather scaled back his farming operations, a large amount of vacant land opened up.
Not wanting to let the land go to waste, he rented it out to various parties, with the bank becoming his biggest tenant. This entire area, from the main road to the parking lot, was land my grandfather had leased to the bank. And I had inherited that property and continued the lease. Although I'd sold much of the other land to cover inheritance taxes, I still owned the area around the bank. Which was precisely why Mr. Watson was scolding Kevin with such fury. Sure, Alex's referral was significant, but more than that, this bank has been indebted to his family's land for generations. And you had the nerve to speak so disrespectfully to Nathan.
I didn't know. If I had been informed, I would never have said anything about his truck.
Scrambling for an excuse, Kevin shifted the blame to me as if it were my fault for not telling him sooner.
Utterly exasperated, I finally spoke up. I included all of that information in my business plan.
Yet it was Kevin who tore it up without even looking at it.
You tore up a client's documents?
Apparently, he hadn't heard that part, and Mr. Watson's anger flared even more. Facing Mr. Watson, who looked furious enough to have steam coming from his head, Kevin turned pale, shrinking in on himself, barely able to breathe.
I would never do such a thing. Nathan must be mistaken.
There's no proof that I did that.
There is proof.
The person who called out to us was a young bank clerk. In his hand was the trash can where Kevin had thrown the documents earlier. Inside the trash can, as expected, lay the torn remains of my business proposal. I was surprised that the meeting ended so quickly, so I thought I'd start tidying up the room.
That's when I found these important documents discarded, so I brought them here. Mind your own business.
In a sudden fit of anger, Kevin lunged toward the young clerk. But just in time, Watson grabbed Kevin's arm, firmly restraining him.
That's enough. Stop this disgraceful behavior. Kevin, I'll decide on the consequences later. For now, go home and await further instructions. Mr. Watson. Please, believe me.
I was only doing my job diligently, working to maximize the bank's profits. Kevin's desperate attempts at an excuse only highlighted his prejudice and misguided efforts. Other staff and security personnel had gathered and began to escort Kevin out of the building, yet he managed to shoot me a resentful glare. No matter how much land you inherited or how many connections you have, you're nothing special yourself.
Loan or no loan, your farm will fail. And that's a fact.
There's no need to worry. My herb farm, Nathan, is growing its revenue steadily. When I answered calmly, Kevin gasped sharply, his voice catching as he tried to respond.
Herb farm. Nathan? You mean the one recognized as a regional revitalization model, backed by the local government, and highly sought after by city restaurants and local supermarkets? Oh, you knew?
Then you should have looked at my business proposal. If he'd simply read the documents instead of making snap judgments, he would have seen who I really was.
I hadn't sought the loan out of financial desperation. In fact,
it was quite the opposite. I was planning an expansion to establish a new high-altitude farm in a neighboring county to support seasonal and variety growth.
As Kevin had unwittingly mentioned, my current herb farm was thriving. With this success, I intended to diversify my offerings and spread out production across the year.
Given the scope of my plans, I could easily have approached a large urban bank. But my loyalty to the local bank, which had served my grandparents, led me to prioritize them, especially with Alex's recommendation. However, if the loan officer has this much animosity toward me, there's nothing more to be done.
I'll consider other banks that may be more suitable. No, please, wait, Nathan.
Mr. Watson, desperate to salvage the situation, ignored Kevin, who now stood stunned, and pleaded with me.
Although Watson wasn't directly responsible for the conflict, the training of his staff was ultimately his duty.
Kevin had judged me solely by my appearance, dismissing me as poor and unworthy.
Despite my family's connection to the bank and Alex's recommendation, I could no longer trust a bank that employed people like him.
Without paying any attention to Mr. Watson, I got into the truck and quietly pressed down on the accelerator. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw Kevin's expression of utter despair as he crumpled to the ground, and before long, he disappeared from sight.
In the end, the local bank ultimately went under.
Apparently, as I left, a group of high school girls had overheard my parting words.
Hey, did you hear that? I think this bank might be in trouble. Really? Does that mean it might go under? We should take out our savings right away.
Although it was simply a misunderstanding, the phrase, "the bank is in trouble," spread rapidly. Through friends, family, and workplace gossip, the rumor took on a life of its own. As a result, countless people who had no idea where the rumors had originated started to believe that the bank was in financial trouble. And they all rushed to the bank's counter to withdraw their savings. Because of this, withdrawals surged, and within just a few days, approximately $2 billion was withdrawn, causing the bank, originally with no issues, to go under. Most of the bank's staff, including Watson, managed to find new jobs, but no one was willing to hire Kevin. Rumors spread that Kevin's behavior had led to the bank's downfall, earning him the nickname Kevin the Bankbreaker. Eventually, Kevin disappeared from town altogether. Some say he was sued for damages for blocking my business deal, or that he borrowed from predatory lenders to make ends meet.
But one thing is certain, I'll never see Kevin's face again.
As for me, I secured funding from another bank shortly after. I am now expanding a new herb farm in the highlands of the neighboring county. My business continues to thrive, and the farm's serene, green setting has become popular with visitors seeking a peaceful retreat. We even opened a restaurant on site, serving fresh herbs and vegetables harvested from our fields. Nowadays, People visit not just for the herbs but to enjoy our dishes. And we offer an array of products like herb bouquets, cookies, cakes, and herbal teas if families come with their kids on weekends. And the farm is always alive with greenery and smiles. Watching this scene, I speak to my grandparents in my heart. Grandpa, you always loved seeing me bring smiles to others. I'll keep working hard to be a grandson you can be proud of. Please, keep watching over me. As I looked up at the clear blue sky, a gentle breeze swept through, softly rustling the herbs as if responding to me.